Hi everyone, and thank you all for attending this talk. I'm Judith Borghouts. I'm a researcher at University of California, Irvine, and I'm excited to talk about a study that we did last year about how people stay motivated while working from home during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all have experienced, the pandemic forced the majority of us to suddenly work from home with little time to prepare. Whereas about 16% of the American workforce worked remotely in 2019, from 2019 to 2021, the number of people working from home tripled. Now, there are a number of benefits about working from home, such as not having to commute, more control over your schedule, and indeed the initial results done during the onset of the lockdown showed that people were actually more productive. However, it also showed that people's workday on average increased by 8.2%. The lack of an imposed structure placed the responsibility on the individual to organize their work, and people experienced challenging unplugging from work. So in the long run, is this way of working sustainable, and can people stay motivated and engaged with work? With many companies switching to a hybrid or fully remote model, it's important for us to understand how we can best support people in working from home. And to understand how people currently manage working from home and any challenges they experience, we conducted a study with 25 information workers. Participants were asked to keep a diary for 1 week, which was used as a prompt to guide the discussion during a semi-structured interview. And for the sake of time for this talk today, I will mostly focus on the findings that came from the interview. The study was done in January and February of 2021. So people had been working from home full-time since the beginning of lockdown of March 2020. Some had started working remotely a little bit earlier, but everyone had prior experience of first working in an office workplace. And to give you an idea of the people who participated in our study, we had 25 information workers from different companies based in the US, though not everyone was physically located in the US at the time of the study, with some of them being in Europe. And the type of work that people were doing can broadly be described as information work, meaning it was cognitively demanding and primarily conducted on a computer. But they had a range of job roles ranging from manager to consultant and worked in various industries. Their typical work schedule was on paper from 9 to 5, though people did have quite high autonomy over how they scheduled their work, and participants indicated that they usually worked way beyond these hours. So a big shift that people experienced was that at the office, they were constantly interrupted by people, whereas at home, this didn't happen nearly as often. While this allowed people to focus on their work and work uninterrupted, it also affected their work motivation. Because colleagues were not only a source of distraction and interruption, but people also drew motivation from the presence of other people, which we have labeled here as peripheral motivation. People had social interactions with other people, they saw others doing similar work, and the act of being at a desk was a clear signal of working. At home, motivation became primarily work-centric. People drew motivation when they felt they were being productive. Their motivation to keep working was driven out of a fear of penalties. And some also took working from home as an opportunity to reflect on what aspects of their work inspired them. But the common thread was that all of the motivation was very much centered on the work itself. And people reported a range of different strategies to address this change in motivation. They made tasks more explicit, they produced more work output to show to others, they took on additional inspiring work tasks, and they worked longer hours overall. And our participants could be roughly grouped in 4 groups, which we have called the achievers, image conscious, self-rechargers, and community seekers, and place these along 2 axes: perspective towards motivation and work priority. Perspective towards motivation refers to whether people were inward-facing, meaning they addressed motivation by reflecting on themselves, or outward-facing, meaning they sought motivation by relying on other people. Work priority relates to whether people were primarily motivated about meeting a productivity standard or whether they sought motivation through enjoyment of work. So let's look at these 4 groups in more detail. The achievers were motivated by meeting a certain self-imposed productivity standards that gave them the sense of accomplishment. At home, it was much harder for these people to gauge whether they had actually been productive, which could induce feelings of stress. And as this quote illustrates, the pressure primarily was self-imposed and came from themselves rather than their boss or anyone else. To address this, they tried to quantify their productivity in other ways, for example through to-do lists and making very explicit what they had worked on. The second group was also focused on meeting a productivity standard, but with the goal to show that they were being productive to others. The loss of a presence in an office meant that people no longer possessed clear signals to convey to others they were working, for example by showing up at the office at 9, being at their desks. At home, there was a perceived fear of penalties if they were not considered to be productive enough. So to compensate, people said they work longer hours at home, produce more work output, and as this quote shows, there was a pressure to always be online even after working hours to show that they were working. The third group didn't find being productive that challenging. Instead, they were more focused at home that they still enjoyed their work. So to stay motivated, they often worked into the evening beyond their work hours to take on additional projects, inspiring work tasks. They read up on books, and they said that being at home and not having someone to look over their shoulder allowed them the time to do that. As this quote says, when I have free range to do more work, I find that I just add more work on top of my own plate. It's something that I don't have to do at the office, but that I really enjoy doing at home. Lastly, the fourth group also focused on enjoyment, but found this by being around and interacting with other people. They reported kind of a dip in motivation at home. They were still being productive, but they said there are fewer social interactions and breaks from work with colleagues, so there's less fun to be had. At home, they attempted to access this source of motivation through Zoom happy hours, hangouts, and it was also interesting to say that some participants said that they were much more willing to interrupt themselves at home and jump on an email or a Slack notification, just anything that was like a form of social interaction. So it is clear that people were affected by and dealt with this shift in motivation differently. So what does this mean for the CSCW community and how people can best be supported? Well, first, it's important to acknowledge that the practical implications should be tailored to different groups. I won't go through each implication today, but at a high level, where some people may benefit more from tools that make it more explicit what they have worked on and give them a feeling of productivity, other people may benefit more from better support of taking breaks with colleagues and also not being made to feel guilty for being away from work. Now, it should be said that since this was done early last year, when most people were working remotely full-time and a lot of things were still on lockdown, it would be really interesting to further study how people navigate and stay motivated in a post-pandemic world. Also, since this was an exploratory study, it will be really interesting to conduct this at a larger scale and maybe develop an assessment tool that would allow people to assess where on the spectrum they fall and what type of tools may work best for them to stay motivated. Thank you so much for being at my talk today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.